Hi, my name's Thomas Flynn and I make sound and music for indie games. While studying music and technology, here's me graduating, I began freelancing as a sound recordist for short films, and after graduating I worked as a web designer doing some interactive web pages before going freelance again as a sound designer and working on a few games since then. I'm going to talk a little bit about sound effects, what they are literally and conceptually, as well as some practical ideas on making and sourcing effects. In terms of our senses, sound often makes up a large portion of the gaming experience, and indeed some games rely heavily on sound for gameplay elements or storytelling. Sound effects can be thought of as noises that impart information, and this is true not just in games and entertainment but in real life too. Most of us experience sound effects every day, your phone's SMS tone for example, and we bring that understanding of sounds to the gaming experience. We know abstract sounds can have meaning. In real life, sound effects happen naturally though, as the result of some activity and not an addition to it. We understand some elements of a game of table tennis via the sounds, how the game is being played, what materials the equipment is made of, and we add this kind of information back into digital games via sound effects. Now let's examine what makes up the soundscape of a game, starting with the most subliminal elements, ambient sounds. This group contains ingredients like weather sounds, traffic sounds, as well as room and space tones, the sounds of empty space. They're often long, looping audio tracks that help put the action in a wider context. Music is not a sound effect as such, but again helps set the tone of a game or particular scene and can convey a lot of information about what players can expect to happen. Having said that, often games have musical sound effects or even entire soundtracks made up of in-game effects mixing together. Which brings us neatly to the idea of stings or cues and the question of when does a sound effect become a piece of music and vice versa. Stings are really short pieces of music that are linked to a significant in-game event. Finally, sound effects give us detailed information about what's happening on screen, helping to describe the action, giving it texture, telling us if something is good or bad, near or far, big or small. And I've included dialogue here, but it could equally be its own category. In-game sounds can be categorized into two groups, diegetic and non-diegetic, concepts which can help us decide what sounds to add into a game. Diegetic or actual sounds originate inside the game world, i.e. both you and your avatar can hear them, and non-diegetic or commentary sounds originate outside the game world just for the player to hear. Depending on the aesthetic of your game, you might want to use real recorded sound effects or synthesize sounds from scratch on the computer. Both are equally good ideas and give different results. Maybe you want the visuals and music and sound effects to exist as a coherent whole, or maybe you want to subvert conventions and try mixing things up. So let's look at a piece of game footage with no sound. I know I probably don't have to convince you that you might want sound in your game, but it's an interesting exercise to think about what does sound add and are sounds fit for purpose. And now with ambient sound effects and music. Moving on, I want to look at more musical sound effects and how they can have implicit meaning because of their musicality. A C triad played in an ascending order suggests to me something positive, something opening up, and conversely the same thing played high to low suggests something more negative or closing down. And now with some repeating notes, instead of having a definite positive or negative dynamic, first using two notes repeated, we get a kind of neutral pause sound. And finally, repeating the same note several times suggests an alert or even an error. So same notes, different meaning. So how do you go about recording a real sound effect? Well, you grab your phone or a cheap portable recorder and some editing software and you get out and you record it. It's not really that difficult, and it can be quite rewarding and even fun. If you want to make sound effects digitally, there are lots of free and paid dedicated sound effect generation apps, for example, ones that just make 8-bit sounds or ones that do synthesized weather effects. Or you could use music software to compose effects with synthesizers and samplers. Let's look quickly at layering a lo-fi hit effect. Starting with a single blast of noise. Repeating it changes the feel slightly. Adding some reverb makes it bigger. A square bass wave with a pitch sweep adds power. And a tremolo and more reverb gives it character. Speaking of signal processing, these 4 basic effects, pan, volume, reverb and delay, can do a lot to position your sound in 3D space and also be used for dramatic effect. If you don't have the time to make your own, there are lots of ways you can get pre-recorded sound effects online. This is useful for sourcing obscure sounds or things you can't record yourself, but making your own sound effects from scratch gives you creative and quality control, as well as unique sounds that no other game will have. Finally, if you're interested in the topic, you might also want to look up the accessibility guidelines on the International Game Developers Association website and gameaccessibilityguidelines.com, where there's information about when it's appropriate to use sound effects to convey information. There's a lot more to sounds in games, but hopefully this has given you some things to think about.